The lights flare, the crowd roars, and Keanu Reeves steps onto the Steve Harvey show, Hollywood's enigma in the flesh. Steve's grin promises laughs, but something's off. Keanu's eyes lock on a glint of gold, a crucifix, and the air thickens. "Can I tell you something I've never said out loud?" he asks, voice low, daring the silence to break. What's he hiding? A secret that could unravel the man behind the myth? Stick around to find out. And hey, where are you watching this from? Drop it in the comments. We're dying to know what you think. The studio buzzed with anticipation as Keanu Reeves stepped onto the set of the Steve Harvey show. The crowd erupted in cheers, their energy a mix of admiration and excitement, the kind reserved for someone who'd become more than just a name on a movie poster. Steve Harvey stood center stage, his grin wide and welcoming, the familiar spark of humor lighting up his eyes. He waved a hand to settle the audience, his voice booming through the mic with that signature warmth that could turn any stranger into a friend. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight's gonna be good," he declared, and the crowd laughed, already hooked on the promise of a lighthearted hour. The theme music pulsed, the lights danced, and for a moment it felt like every other episode, full of charm, quick wit, and maybe a few Hollywood anecdotes to keep things rolling. Keanu walked out, hands in his pockets, his steps steady but unhurried. He wore dark jeans, a plain black shirt, and a blazer that didn't scream for attention, just him as always, a quiet figure against the glare of the spotlight. The audience roared louder, but he only gave a small wave, a soft smile tugging at his lips, his head dipping slightly as if the applause caught him off guard. Steve watched him approach, cue cards in hand, ready to steer the conversation with his usual blend of jokes and heart. He knew the drill: keep it fun, keep it moving, give the people what they came for. But tonight, something felt different from the jump, a shift in the air that neither the audience nor Steve could quite pin down yet. "Give it up one more time for Keanu Reeves," Steve called out, and the crowd obliged, their cheers bouncing off the studio walls. Keanu took his seat across from Steve, settling into the chair with a nod of thanks. Steve leaned forward, his grin softening into something more genuine. "Man, I gotta say, it's an honor to have you here," he began, his tone carrying a weight that went beyond the usual talk show banter. "Now, the media calls you the kindest man in Hollywood. The internet says you're the last good guy left. But me? I say you're the realest example of grace I've ever seen." The audience clapped again, a wave of agreement rippling through the seats. Keanu shifted, his smile fading into a shy laugh, his hand rubbing the back of his neck. "I'm just a guy trying to do his best," he said, his voice low, almost lost in the noise of the room. Steve chuckled, shaking his head. "That's exactly what makes you special, man." He set his cue cards down, signaling this wasn't going to be a scripted chat. The crowd quieted, sensing the shift, their laughter giving way to curiosity. Steve leaned back, crossing one leg over the other, his eyes locked on Keanu. "We all know you from the big screen, John Wick, The Matrix, but tonight, I want to talk about the real you, the guy people feel like they know, even if they've never met you." Keanu nodded, his gaze steady but unguarded, like he was ready to let the mask slip, if only for a moment. The conversation started easy enough. Steve tossed out a few questions about Keanu's latest projects, but it didn't take long for the tone to deepen. "You've got this reputation," Steve said, his voice softening. "Folks see you out there, giving up your seat on the subway, helping crew members on set, even handing out bonuses to the people behind the scenes. What's that about?" Keanu shrugged, his expression calm but thoughtful. "To me, it's just the right thing to do. Everybody's going through something. Sometimes the smallest thing, like a seat or a kind word, can change their whole day." The audience murmured, a few nodding, his words settling into the room like a gentle truth. Steve grinned, but his eyes held something deeper, a flicker of admiration. "See, that's what I'm talking about. In a world full of flash and noise, you're like a quiet lighthouse in Hollywood's storm." The metaphor landed, and the crowd let out a soft "ooh" hanging on every word. Keanu tilted his head, a faint smile returning. "I don't know about that," he said, "but I've always felt like none of this, fame, money, any of it, is promised. You lose enough, and you figure out what really matters." His voice dipped, carrying a weight that pulled the room in closer. "That's when it happened. As Steve nodded, his hand brushed the small crucifix hanging around his neck, a simple gold cross he'd worn for years, a quiet piece of faith he carried everywhere. Keanu's eyes caught it, lingering there for a beat longer than expected. The air shifted, the lightness of the show giving way to something heavier, something real. Steve didn't notice at first, still riding the rhythm of the interview. "You've seen a lot, haven't you?" he asked. "Success, sure, but life's thrown some punches too." Keanu nodded, his gaze still on the cross. "Yeah," he said, his voice quieter now, almost reverent. "More than most people know." The studio lights dimmed slightly, not by design, just a trick of perception as the mood turned inward. Steve leaned in, sensing the change, but not yet sure where it was headed. "What keeps you grounded through all that?" he asked. Keanu paused, his fingers tapping lightly on his knee, like he was weighing whether to go deeper. Then he looked up, meeting Steve's eyes with a clarity that cut through the room. "Steve," he said, his tone low and deliberate, "can I tell you something I've never revealed in public?" The question hung there, sharp and unexpected, slicing through the talk show polish. Steve blinked, caught off guard, but he didn't hesitate. He nodded, setting his cue cards aside completely. "Go ahead, man," he said, his voice steady but curious. The audience went still, no whispers, no shifting in seats, just pure, human attention locked on Keanu. He took a slow breath, his eyes drifting for a moment, maybe to a memory, maybe to a place he'd never shared before. Whatever it wasn't Hollywood fluff. It was truth, raw and unfiltered, waiting to spill out. Steve tilted his head, his hand resting over the crucifix now, instinct more than show. "You've got the floor," he said softly. Keanu leaned forward slightly, his voice barely above a whisper, but loud enough to carry. "There's a story I've kept to myself for years," he began, "and it starts with a night I wasn't sure I'd make it through." The room held its breath, the weight of his words sinking in. This wasn't the Keanu Reeves they'd come to see, the action star, the meme, the legend. This was a man, stripped bare, about to let them into a place he'd guarded fiercely. "Hey," Steve interjected, breaking the tension just enough to keep it real. "If this moment's already tugging at your heart, stick around. Subscribe to catch more stories like this." The crowd chuckled lightly, but their eyes stayed on Keanu, waiting. He smiled faintly, acknowledging the nudge, then leaned in closer. "It's about loss," he said, "and it's about finding something, or someone, that pulled me back from the edge." Steve's hand tightened around the cross, a silent signal he was ready to listen. And with that, the stage was set, not for laughs or applause, but for something sacred, something that would change everything. Steve Harvey leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, the studio lights catching the gleam of the crucifix around his neck. The audience was still, their earlier cheers replaced by a quiet that felt alive, waiting. "Keanu," Steve said, his voice warm but probing. "Folks talk about you like you're some kind of saint out there, giving up your seat on the subway, helping crew members, even cutting your own pay to make sure the stunt teams get theirs. What's behind that?" He tilted his head, a half smile playing on his lips, inviting Keanu to open up. Keanu shifted in his chair, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. He looked down for a moment, then back up at Steve, his eyes steady but soft. "It's not a big deal," he said, his tone gentle, almost dismissive. "It's just what you do when you see someone hurting. You don't think about it, you just act." The simplicity of his words hit the room like a ripple, and a few people in the audience nodded, as if they could feel the truth in it. Steve raised an eyebrow, leaning back. "Just what you do, huh? Man, most people don't see it that way. Most people walk right by." Keanu shrugged, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. "Maybe. But I've been on the other side of that. I know what it's like to need a hand and not get it." His voice dipped, carrying a shadow of something older, something heavier. Steve picked up on it, his grin fading into a look of quiet curiosity. "The other side?" he asked, his hand brushing the crucifix again, an unconscious gesture that seemed to ground him. Keanu nodded, taking a slow breath. "Yeah, growing up, things weren't easy. I was born in Lebanon. Beirut, actually. My mom moved us to Canada when I was a kid. My dad, he left when I was 3. Didn't see him much after that." The audience stayed silent, absorbing the weight of his words. Steve's eyes softened. "That's a lot of moving around for a little kid," he said. Keanu gave a small nod. it was. But it wasn't just that. My sister, Kim, she got leukemia when we were young. I watched her fight it day after day, hospitals, needles, waiting rooms. She was tougher than I'll ever be. His voice cracked just slightly, and he paused, letting the memory settle. But the system wasn't kind to us. My mom worked 2 jobs, and still, the bills piled up. Healthcare wasn't there the way it should have been. I saw what it did to her, to us. Steve's hand tightened around the crucifix, his lips pressing together as he listened. The audience felt it too, a pang of recognition, a shared ache for a world where fairness slipped through the cracks. Keanu went on, his tone steady but laced with something raw. Later, when I started working in Hollywood, I saw it again. Stunt guys risking their lives for a scene, camera operators pulling 16-hour days, makeup artists who barely make rent. A world of shadows where paychecks vanish before the bills are paid. He shook his head, his gaze drifting to the floor. I couldn't just sit there and let it happen, not when I could do something. Steve nodded, his voice low. So you stepped in, gave him what you could? Keanu looked up, meeting his eyes. Yeah. If I've got more than I need, why not? It's not charity, it's righting a wrong. Those people carry the movies just as much as I do. The audience stirred, a few wiping their eyes, others whispering to the person next to them. Steve leaned forward again, his tone earnest. You're talking about justice, man, not just kindness. Keanu tilted his head, considering it. Maybe. But it's personal, too. I've lost people, lost a lot. You start to see how fragile it all is. He paused, his fingers tapping lightly on his knee, like he was deciding how far to go. Then he looked at Steve, his voice dropping to a near whisper. My daughter was stillborn. Ava. That was, I don't even have words for it. And then Jennifer. My partner, she was gone a couple years later, car accident. The anaphora came naturally, heavy with grief. I lost her. I lost them. I lost pieces of myself I didn't even know I had. The room went dead quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your chest. Steve's hand froze on the crucifix, his eyes glistening as he took it in. The audience felt it too. Some leaned forward, others sank back, hands covering their mouths. Keanu's pain wasn't loud or dramatic. It was a quiet wound laid bare for them to see. After that, he continued, I could have gone hard. Could have let it turn me cold, but I didn't want that. I didn't want to be the guy who stopped feeling, so I chose something else. Softness, I guess. Trying to help where I could. Steve exhaled, long and slow, his voice thick with emotion. Man, I don't even know what to say to that. He shook his head, his fingers tracing the edge of the cross. You've been through hell, and you still come out giving? That's not normal. Keanu smiled faintly, almost apologetic. I don't know if it's giving, it's just living. You see someone struggling, on a set, on a subway, anywhere, and you think, I've been there. You don't walk away. The audience was with him now, their hearts open, some nodding through tears. Steve sat back, his hand still on the crucifix, its gold catching the light like a quiet anchor in the storm of Keanu's story. You're telling me you've turned pain into something else, he said. Something good? Keanu nodded, his eyes drifting to the cross again. I had to, otherwise it wins. The pain, the unfairness, it takes everything. I couldn't let that happen. Steve's lips trembled slightly, but he held it together, his voice steadying. You know, I've seen a lot of people on this stage. Big names, big stories. But you're different. You're carrying something real. He tapped the crucifix lightly, almost like he was drawing strength from it. Keanu looked at him, his expression softening. Maybe, but I didn't always know how to carry it. There were nights I didn't think I'd make it through. Nights where the silence was louder than anything else. The weight of that hung in the air, a thread connecting his past to whatever he'd hinted at earlier. Steve leaned in, his eyes searching Keanu's face. Those nights. What got you through them? Keanu paused, his gaze locking on the crucifix again like it held an answer he hadn't planned to share yet. Sometimes, he said, it was the smallest thing. A stranger's kindness, a moment that reminded me I wasn't alone. He looked up at Steve, his voice firm but tender. And sometimes it was something bigger, something I didn't expect. Steve's hand rested fully over the cross now, his breath catching as he felt the shift coming. The audience leaned in, their emotions raw, tethered to every word. Keanu's story wasn't just his anymore, it was theirs, a mirror to their own struggles, their own losses. "If this hits home," Steve said, his voice breaking the tension just enough. "Join us. Subscribe for more stories that matter." The crowd gave a soft murmur of agreement, but their eyes stayed on Keanu, waiting for what came next. He took a breath, steadying himself, and the room braced for the deeper truth he was about to unfold. The studio lights seemed to soften as Keanu Reeves leaned forward, his hands resting on his knees, his voice dropping to a hush that pulled the audience in like a tide. Steve Harvey sat across from him, his hands still on the crucifix, his eyes locked on Keanu's face, sensing something big was coming. The room was thick with anticipation, the kind that makes your chest tighten, and Keanu took a slow, deliberate breath before he spoke. "There was a night," he began, his tone steady but heavy, "a few years back, where I didn't know if I wanted to keep going." Steve's eyebrows lifted slightly, but he didn't interrupt. The audience held its breath, some leaning forward, others clutching the arms of their seats. Keanu's gaze drifted not to Steve or the crowd, but to a place only he could see. "I'd been carrying everything, my sister's fight, losing Ava, losing Jennifer, it piled up, and that night it all just broke me." His words landed like stones in still water, rippling through the room. "I couldn't move, couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. I was alone in my house, sitting in the dark, and I started thinking maybe that was it. Maybe I was done." The silence in the studio was deafening, a paradox that screamed louder than any sound. Steve's hand tightened around the crucifix, his knuckles whitening, but he stayed quiet, giving Keanu the space to unravel. "I had been to a homeless shelter earlier that day," Keanu continued, his voice gaining a raw edge. "I'd gone to drop off some food, clothes, nothing big, just something to do. But I saw these people, men, women, kids, shuffled off to the edges of the city, like they didn't exist. No heat in the building, no real help coming, society just forgot them." He shook his head, his jaw tightening. "And I realized I felt the same way. Forgotten, invisible, stuck in my own cold corner." Steve's lips parted, but no words came out. The audience felt it too, a collective ache tying Keanu's isolation to the world's neglect. A woman in the front row wiped her eyes, her hand trembling. Keanu pressed on, his voice softer now, almost fragile. "I got home that night, and I couldn't shake it. The shelter, the losses, it all swirled together. So I picked up my phone, just scrolling, trying to drown it out. Not looking for anything, just..." He paused, his eyes flicking to Steve's crucifix, then back up. "And that's when I found it. A clip of you." Steve blinked, startled, his hand dropping slightly from the cross. "Me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Keanu nodded, a faint smile breaking through the weight on his face. "Yeah, it was grainy, kinda old. You were on a stage, not this one, somewhere else. Holding a mic, talking about purpose. You said, 'God doesn't waste pain.' And you were wearing that," he pointed to the crucifix, its gold glinting under the lights, "that exact cross." The room seemed to shrink, the air growing thick with emotion. Steve's hand went back to the cross, his fingers curling around it like it was the only thing keeping him steady. "I don't even remember which talk that was," he said, his voice cracking. Keanu's smile widened, tender but firm. "It doesn't matter, it wasn't just what you said, it was how you said it, like you'd been through it, like you knew. You talked about storms, about how sometimes the thing breaking you is breaking you open, and then you said, 'If you're still breathing, God's not finished with you yet.'" A tear slipped down Steve's cheek, unscripted and unhidden. He didn't wipe it away, just let it fall, his eyes locked on Keanu. The audience was a sea of quiet sobs now, some holding hands, others staring wide-eyed, caught in the gravity of the moment. Keanu leaned in closer, his voice a whisper that carried to every corner. "In that silence, I heard everything. Pain whispered truths fame couldn't shout. I watched that clip 3 times that night, Steve. 3 times. And the next morning, for the first time in weeks, I got out of bed." Steve's breath hitched, his hand pressing the crucifix against his chest. "You're telling me," he started, but his voice broke and he had to swallow hard to keep going. "You're telling me that got you through?" Keanu nodded, his eyes shining with something beyond gratitude. Reverence, maybe. It did, not because it fixed me. I wasn't fixed, but because it made me feel seen. Like someone out there understood, and that was enough to keep me here. The studio was a cathedral now, not a stage. The cameras rolled, but they felt irrelevant, dwarfed by the raw humanity unfolding. Steve's tears fell freely, and he didn't fight them. "Man," he said, his voice thick, "I just talked from the heart. I had no idea." Keanu cut in, gentle but firm. "That's what made it real. You weren't trying to save me, you were just being you. And that's what pulled me back." A man in the back row let out a quiet sob, his head dropping into his hands. A mother hugged her teenage daughter, both of them crying softly. Keanu's story wasn't just his, it was theirs. A thread connecting personal despair to the world's forgotten corners. Steve wiped his face with the back of his hand, the crucifix still clutched tight. "You saw that shelter," he said, piecing it together, "and then you saw me. What'd that do to you?" Keanu sat back, his hands resting in his lap, his voice steady again. "It hit me hard. Those people at the shelter, they were me, in a way. Alone, overlooked, fighting to hold on. And then your words came through that screen, like a lifeline I didn't know I needed. It wasn't loud or fancy, just honest. And it reminded me that maybe I wasn't as lost as I thought." He looked at Steve, his eyes clear. "You didn't know it, but you were my anchor that night." Steve shook his head, overwhelmed, his tears glistening under the lights. "I'm just a guy with a mic, man," he said, his voice trembling. "I ain't no hero." Keanu leaned forward again, his tone unwavering. "You don't have to be. You just have to show up. And you did." The audience felt the weight of that, a truth sinking deep. Hope doesn't need a cape. It just needs a voice. Steve exhaled, a shaky breath that carried years of his own struggles. "This is why we share these moments," he said, looking out at the crowd, then back at Keanu. "Subscribe if you believe in second chances." The call landed soft, almost lost in the emotion, but the audience nodded, some already reaching for their phones, not out of obligation, but connection. Keanu smiled faintly, his eyes still on Steve's crucifix, the quiet anchor that had tied their stories together. The room braced itself, sensing this wasn't the end, just the peak of something bigger, something that would leave them all changed. The studio air felt charged, heavy with the echo of Keanu Reeves' revelation. Steve Harvey sat back in his chair, the crucifix still pressed against his chest, his eyes red-rimmed but steady as he absorbed what Keanu had just laid bare. The audience was a quiet sea, their tears drying but their hearts still open, tethered to the raw exchange unfolding before them. Keanu leaned forward again, his hands clasped, his voice soft but deliberate, like he was handing Steve something fragile yet unbreakable. "There's something you said in that clip," he began. "Something I've carried with me ever since. You said, 'God doesn't call the qualified, He qualifies the called.'" Steve's breath caught, his lips parting as the words hit him, a phrase he'd tossed out years ago, unscripted, from a place of instinct rather than polish. He nodded slowly, almost to himself, as Keanu continued. "That stuck with me, Steve. Because I'd heard sermons before, big ones, loud ones, the kind with choirs and spotlights, but they never reached me. They felt too perfect, too far away. Your words? They were different. They were real, like you'd lived them." Keanu's eyes locked on Steve's, unwavering. "You're a minister in disguise, man. You don't even know it." The room stirred, a ripple of gasps and murmurs threading through the seats. Steve shook his head, a short, broken laugh escaping him. "A minister?" he said, his voice thick with disbelief. "Me? Nah. I'm just a comedian trying to make it, same as everybody else." He rubbed a hand across his face, the crucifix swaying slightly as he moved. "I got flaws, man. I got doubts. I look at this world, racial inequality tearing us apart, folks working 3 jobs and still drowning in debt, and I wonder if I'm even worthy to talk about faith. I ain't no saint." Keanu tilted his head, his expression softening into something gentle but firm. "That's exactly why it works," he said. Your scars speak louder than sermons, Steve. You don't stand up there pretending you've got it all figured out. You're real about the mess, the pain, the chaos. And that's what makes you a beacon for people like me, people who are broken and don't know where to turn. His voice was steady, a quiet force that cut through Steve's doubt like a blade through fog. Steve's hand dropped from the crucifix, resting in his lap as he stared at Keanu, his eyes searching. "You really believe that?" he asked, his tone raw, vulnerable. "That I'm reaching people like that?" Keanu nodded, a faint smile breaking through. "I'm proof of it. That night, when I was lost in the dark, your voice was like a compass in a storm. It didn't tell me where to go, it just showed me I wasn't alone. And that's more than any perfect preacher ever gave me." The audience felt the shift, a warmth spreading through the room like sunlight after rain. A man in the third row nodded, his eyes glistening again, while a woman beside him squeezed her husband's hand, her lips trembling with a quiet smile. Steve exhaled, long and slow, his shoulders slumping, as if a weight he'd carried for years had finally eased. "I've questioned it, he admitted, his voice low but clear. Wondered if all this comedy, hosting, speaking means anything. I've messed up plenty, fell short of what I thought faith should look like." Keanu leaned back, his hands resting loosely now, his gaze steady. "That's the thing, Steve. Faith isn't perfection, it's persistence. You keep showing up, scars and all, and that's what bridges the divide between you and me, between all of us." He gestured faintly toward the audience, his words wrapping around them like a shared promise. "You don't have to be spotless to shine, you just have to keep going." Steve's lips pressed together, a tear slipping free despite his effort to hold it back. He wiped it away quickly, but the emotion stayed, raw and unhidden. "Man," he said, his voice cracking, "I never thought about it like that. I just try to get through my own stuff and hope it helps somebody else along the way." Keanu's smile widened, gentle but sure. "It does. More than you'll ever know." For a moment they just sat there, the silence between them alive with understanding. Then, almost as if moved by the same unspoken cue, they both stood. The audience watched, breathless, as Keanu took a step forward, his arms opening slightly. Steve didn't hesitate. He stepped in, and they embraced. Not as host and guest, not as star and comedian, but as equals. Two men shaped by pain and lifted by something greater. Steve's hand rested on Keanu's shoulder, Keanu's on Steve's back, and the room felt it, a mutual healing, a closing of a circle neither had known was open. The crowd rose slowly, not clapping, not cheering, just standing in reverence, their faces a mix of tears and quiet awe. A young man in the back row pressed his hands together, his head bowed slightly, while an older woman near the front clutched her purse, her eyes shining with something like pride. The embrace lasted only a moment, but it stretched beyond time, a symbol of what they'd built together in that hour. A bridge across divides, a light through the cracks. Steve stepped back first, his hand finding the crucifix again, his voice shaky but strong. "You've given me something today, man," he said, looking at Keanu. "Something I didn't even know I needed." Keanu nodded, his expression calm but deep. "You gave it to me first, years ago, through that screen. I'm just bringing it back." The audience felt the shift settle, a truth sinking in. Faith wasn't about being flawless. It was about showing up, flaws and all, and letting that persistence ripple out. Steve glanced out at the crowd, then back at Keanu, a small smile breaking through his tears. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. Keanu shrugged, his own smile mirroring Steve's. "You don't have to say anything. You already did." The moment hung there, tender and profound, a resolution not of conflict but of doubt, two men finding purpose in each other's brokenness. The studio lights seemed to glow a little warmer, the air a little lighter, and the audience sat back down, not ready to let go but ready to hear what came next. Keanu and Steve took their seats again, the connection between them unspoken but unbreakable, a testament to the power of authenticity, persistence, and the quiet faith that binds us all. The studio hummed with a quiet reverence as Keanu Reeves and Steve Harvey settled back into their seats, the embrace still lingering in the air like a promise kept. Steve's hand rested on the crucifix, his eyes glistening but calm, while Keanu sat with a steady presence, his gaze fixed on Steve with an intensity that hinted at something more. The audience watched, their hearts full, sensing the story wasn't over yet. Then Keanu leaned forward, his voice low but clear, carrying a weight that shifted the room once again. "Steve," he said, "there's one more thing I need to tell you." Steve tilted his head, his brow furrowing slightly. "What's that, man?" he asked, his tone soft but curious. Keanu reached into his blazer pocket, pulling out a plain white envelope, its edges worn as if he'd carried it for a while. He held it for a moment, his fingers tracing the seam, then looked up at Steve. "After that night, after your words pulled me back, I couldn't just sit still. I had to do something with it, something bigger." He paused, his eyes shining with a mix of resolve and gratitude. "I started a foundation, quietly, no press. It's for underprivileged artists, people like the stunt crews and makeup folks who never get a fair shot, and for healthcare access, so no one else has to fight like my sister did or lose like I lost Jennifer." The audience gasped softly, a wave of awe rippling through the seats. Steve's jaw dropped, his hand slipping from the crucifix as he stared at Keanu. "A foundation?" he whispered, almost to himself. Keanu nodded, holding out the envelope. "Yeah, and this? It's for you. A grant to expand your show's outreach, to help struggling families, the ones the system forgets. I figured if your words could lift me, your platform could lift them." He placed the envelope in Steve's trembling hands, his voice steady. "It's not just my legacy, it's ours." Steve looked down at the envelope, his fingers shaking as he opened it. Inside was a letter, simple but official, detailing a sum that made his breath catch. $1 million earmarked for community aid. Tears welled up again, spilling over as he shook his head in disbelief. "Man," he said, his voice breaking, this is God's work through broken hands." He clutched the letter to his chest, the crucifix glinting like an anchor of hope, its symbolism tying their stories together in a way neither could have foreseen. The audience was on its feet now, not clapping, not cheering, just standing, united in a quiet reverence that felt holy. A young woman in the back wiped her eyes, her face alight with wonder, while an older man nodded solemnly, his hands clasped tight. Keanu stood too, stepping closer to Steve. "I didn't plan to tell you this here," he admitted, his voice tender. "But sitting with you, seeing that cross, it felt right. Pain birthed this, Steve. My pain, your words, and now it's a legacy." Steve rose, the envelope still in his grip, and looked at Keanu with a mix of awe and humility. "You turned your hurt into this?" he asked, his tone raw. Keanu nodded, a faint smile breaking through. "With your help, yeah, even when you didn't know it." Steve exhaled, a shaky laugh escaping him. "Then let's finish this right," he said. He reached out, taking Keanu's hand, and bowed his head. "Let's pray." The studio fell silent, a stage becoming a sanctuary in an instant. "Lord," Steve began, his voice steady despite the tears, "we ain't perfect. We're just two guys who've been through it. But if you can use us, our pain, our hands, give us the strength to keep shining. Not for fame, but for them." He nodded toward the audience, their faces a mosaic of hope. Keanu's voice joined in, soft but sure. "And let this be a start, not an end, for the ones who need it most." They lifted their heads, hands still clasped, and the audience stood taller, their silence louder than any applause. The ending was a surprise. Keanu's pain had fueled a purpose no one saw coming, and Steve's platform stretched beyond entertainment into something eternal. Steve looked out at the crowd, his eyes bright. "This is what it's about," he said, his voice firm, "turning the hurt into healing." Keanu smiled, stepping back, the envelope a quiet testament between them. The lights dimmed slightly, the moment settling into something sacred. Steve turned to the audience one last time, his voice a gentle nudge. "If this moved you, subscribe. Let's keep spreading light together." The words faded, but the feeling lingered, a cathartic close that left them all uplifted, bound by a legacy born from brokenness. Keanu and Steve's story hits hard. Pain isn't just personal, it's a spark for change. I see it as proof that our scars can build something beautiful, though some might argue it's naive to think one act fixes a broken world. Either way, it's a call to look at our own struggles and ask, what can they birth? Thanks for joining me on this journey. Your thoughts matter. Drop a comment. Do you agree pain fuels purpose, or is it just survival? Subscribe if you're moved. Let's keep exploring these stories together and shining light where it's needed most.